So Dr. Rinku Roy Chowdhury is an associate professor of geography at Clark University. She holds a BA in computer science and environmental science, an MS in conservation ecology, and a PhD in geography. Her research and teaching interests lie in landscape change, political and cultural ecology, archaeoecology, and urban ecology and climate resilience, with projects based locally, Worcester and central Massachusetts, nationally, multiple U.S. cities, and globally, Mexico and South Asia. She's a leader in global environmental science policy initiatives, for example, in the Global Land Program at glp.earth and in the U.S. Long-Term Ecological Research Network. Martha Gach is Mass Audubon's Regional Education Manager for Central Massachusetts and the Conservation Coordinator at Broad Meadow Brook Wildlife Sanctuary and Conservation Center in Worcester. She holds an AB in biology and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. Martha designed and manages Broad Meadow Brook's abundant gardens for wildlife, pollinators, and water quality, oversees ecological management within the rest of the large urban sanctuary, and volunteers with the Blackstone River Water Quality Monitoring Program. Martha also serves as Shrewsbury Conservation Commission and the Community Preservation Committee. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Tessa. So as Martha is sharing her screen, I'm just going to introduce very briefly the context for what you're going to see in this next hour, which is really the outcome of the work of a number of students at Clark University, initiating with an Urban Ecology Advanced seminar last fall semester, in which we basically had 3 PhD students, 6 master students, and 4 undergraduates, in addition to Julia Wagner, who was a wonderful teaching assistant, and Julia is a PhD student as well. And we really focused on the human dimensions of urban stream restoration, and the restoration project is what Martha is going to begin by providing some context for in Broad Meadow Brook right here in Worcester. So over to you, Martha.
Okay, thank you so much, Rinku. So my job here is to set the stage for the project, to help you understand the context of this incredibly complicated but amazing project that we are just really in the beginning stages of undertaking. My job is the on-the-ground ecologist and the liaison with the sanctuary itself. So that's the context that I'm bringing this morning. So this project is taking place within this entity, which is a wildlife sanctuary, Broad Meadow Brook. It is situated squarely within a neighborhood. You can see there's a house over here. There are houses on either side. This building here is our education center, which was renovated from an existing house. And then this is the entry that visitors see. This site is visited by, we figure, about 18 to 20,000 people every year. So it's a heavily used place, and the neighbors love it, and hence the community engagement piece of this. Broad Meadow Brook is part of the Mass Audubon system. There are wildlife sanctuaries all through the state. This is number 17. So Worcester, the heart of the Commonwealth. Right there. Forgot that arrow was animated. And here's the overview of the sanctuary. So it's this amazing green space. It holds the last remaining natural wetland within the city of Worcester. And that wetland approximately follows this line here. This road is Route 20, which is a heavily traveled highway. And that comes into the story a little bit later. And then this star here is the main entryway to the sanctuary. So this is where many visitors, but not all of them, enter. And the place that we're going to focus on is up here at the north end of the sanctuary. And you can see it's a fair distance. This is about a little bit over a mile from the main entry point. And the thing to take away from this picture is we have this amazing green space, but it is surrounded by highly developed suburban, urban neighborhoods, lots of opportunities for people to enter. The sanctuary is very porous, so there are a lot of neighborhood linked trails that go into it. So it really is a heavily used resource by the community. It's also highly impacted. This area up here is a junkyard on top of a hill. So you can imagine what happens with that. So you're probably wondering what the line here is, and that is a power line right of way that runs through, and that will come into play also. Land ownership of this sanctuary is a little bit complicated. There are 3 owners of various portions of land, and that will that will come up again in Rinku's portion. But the City of Worcester owns about 30% of the sanctuary through the Conservation Commission. National Grid owns about 30%, and Mass Audubon owns about 30%. And I know this is typical in many large land holdings these days. This is the way conservation is done. Mass Audubon is the designated manager of the entire complex. So we have legal agreements in place with the other partners, but we have the opportunity to oversee the management and the public access opportunities within the sanctuary. The wetlands complex that I pointed out before, you can see here. The part that we're going to be focusing on is in the northern section of the sanctuary. So this is, again, this is the point of entry for many of our visitors. This building is staffed year-round. I wanted to point out the landscaping, not just because I had a hand in it, but because it's an example of how we try to model sustainability. So that's a message that we try to communicate every day through our activities and passively to our visitors through signage and just through examples. The green area in the foreground is actually a parking median. So there's a parking lot above and a parking lot below, and it's planted in native shrubs and not mowed, but managed. There are rain gardens that are just out of sight that accept all the runoff from the paved surfaces and the building roofs. You can see the solar arrays on top of the nature center as well. So modeling actions for sustainability. And we are very connected with watershed education and water quality. As was mentioned in the introduction, we're part of the Blackstone River water quality monitoring program. We actually host that site. The fountain here is a generalized model of a watershed, but it's supposed to represent the Blackstone watershed in particular, and you can see the interpretive signage to the right there. So we really are focused on water quality enhancement, and water quality education. The trail network on the sanctuary, there are 5 miles of trails. 1 mile is accessible with specific physical improvements for that goal. And the trails wind throughout the sanctuary. Again, the area that we're focusing on is up at the north here. But there's a lot of habitat diversity within the sanctuary as well. And the wetlands are just part of it. Not that that necessarily plays into the community engagement piece, but just to give you a sense of what's physically on the ground. And again, the aerial view with a focus on the site of the stream restoration. And again, notice the distance from the main entrance and the proximity to all the neighborhoods. We're in the headwaters of the Blackstone River watershed. And so water quality water health is really important, not just for the areas that we're in, but also for everyone downstream. So this project is really exciting because it has the potential to improve water quality further downstream in the watershed, not just immediately. The overview of this project very specifically is that we have an area, a highly degraded wetland, about 40 acres or so, that's situated within a residential neighborhood. Development has grown up around it and continues to put pressure on the wetland. The stream itself has been channelized. That would be number 2 in here. So you can see the nice straight channel that was artificially dug. We're still trying to figure out exactly when that happened, but that is not the natural flow of a stream. The stream is also culverted in that area of the red rectangle here, where it is put underground for about 500 feet. And I have a picture of that a little bit later. This stream functions as part of the city's stormwater management system. And alongside it, parallel to it, is a municipal sewer main. That causeway of the sewer main and the subsequent trail that's built up over it has altered the hydrology of this wetland. And we also have an invasive species concern in it. Multiple invasive species concerns from the ecologist standpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you down a very brief tour of the area on the ground so that you can get a sense of what we're working with. The brook starts at this head wall, which drains about 2 square miles of that highly developed urban neighborhood area. So when the water comes out, it's highly impacted. You can see a couple of challenges. There's a trash boom, that green line up here, which is meant to hold back the litter that comes in through the storm drains. It's pretty ineffective. And actually there had been trash racks installed when this culvert was built, but and they were effective, but the neighbors complained that the backup of the litter was damming the brook and causing flooding in some basements. And so the city, to preserve the relationship with the neighborhood, took them out, installed the trash boom. There's still a lot of litter that gets past it. You can also see that there is shoaling here. That gives you a clue as to the intense flashiness of this. Because the brook drains impervious surface mostly, whenever there is a storm, the water level rises very quickly and the water velocity is pretty amazing in this stream. So it often will overtop its banks. So that is the very start of the brook. And then we can see the main part of the channel and the trail, and you can see how straight it is. On the right-hand side, we have an area that is almost exclusively Phragmites. On the left-hand side to the west, we have an area that is primarily native vegetation. Phragmites is creeping in. We're working on that. On the ground, this is what the trail looks like. We occasionally have community cleanups to take the trash out of the brook. That's what's happening on this day. We have a parent and a couple of his children. And then this public trail overtops the sanitary sewer, and the brook functions as a stormwater system. And we also have, there's amazing wildlife that happens that uses this area. Beavers will cycle in and cycle back out. When they cycle in, the city gets nervous because the water level is raised up. So they have installed these water leveling devices called beaver deceivers. And they work for a while, and then the beavers leave and the dams deteriorate, and you're left with the system of pipes and metal poles and wire baskets, etc. but it's a good way to teach about beavers. At the end of that straightway, this is where the brook disappears for 500 feet. It is channelized, it is culverted, and it's been that way long enough for a lovely secondary forest to grow over it. So the reason that we are able to do this project, this restoration, the reason we're even able to consider it is because the city in 2016 was awarded money to do a sewer upgrade that impacted Route 20, where there hadn't been public sewerage. And Route 20, if you remember, runs along the southern end of the sanctuary. The sanitary system that is buried under that causeway, under that trail, has been decommissioned, taken offline. The city no longer needs it. So that means that we have the opportunity to remove parts of it, reconnect the two sides of the wetlands complex, restore the hydrology, and regain our wetland the way it's supposed to function. I apologize for the boring slide, but these are the goals, the overall goals. So to restore the wetland complex, to improve climate resilience, because if we can open back up the wetlands to accept more water when that stream floods with the increasing storms that we're expecting, that's a win. That's going to be able to let us store more water, reduce flooding risk downstream, et cetera, and hopefully reduce flooding risk in the neighborhood itself, the surrounding neighborhood. We're aiming to renaturalize the stream channel, and at the same time to enhance the sanctuary visitor experience by changing up the trail system, perhaps opening up more of the wetlands, putting in boardwalks, enabling people to get up closer to the wetlands and have that amazing experience. And then there, of course, is the opportunity to inspire increased stewardship of this wetlands community by wetlands complex by getting the community more involved. And this project would not be possible without the involvement of a whole lot of partners. Mass Audubon is overseeing it, but we're also working with the Blackstone Watershed Coalition and Collaborative, and Stefanie Covino will speak to that later. The city of Worcester, of course, since they are the principal landowners and it's their sewer system. And then funding through a variety of organizations, and partnership with the Division of Ecological Restoration. They've been amazing partners. And I saved the best for last. I hope I didn't cause any anxiety, Rinku, that you weren't there. But the community engagement piece is obviously huge, and we are really, really fortunate to be able to work with Clark University and with Rinku and with other faculty on this project. So I would like to, at this point, turn it over to Rinku.
Thank you so much, Martha. That was fantastic, and really sort of sets the stage nicely for a brief tour that Julia and I are going to take us through of a story map that we have developed as a starting point towards planning the community engagement piece that Martha just mentioned. So just give me one moment, and I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Martha, would you mind unsharing your presentation?
I am trying to do that right now. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to begin by saying that there's a lot of content here in this Esri story map that we have developed, much more than can be fit in 20 to 30 minutes. But this is going to be unveiled over the next few weeks, or essentially a month or so. It is not publicly published yet because we're working on finalizing and fine-tuning a couple of pieces of it. but this is going to be the main vehicle. I don't have slides, but I'm basically going to walk us through the story map that we've developed. So one of the first steps in thinking about community engagement is to actually think about the place in a long view and in the context of changing land uses and community settlement and development and concern. So the class that I mentioned really began by considering, the class was on urban ecology more broadly, but we worked on a collaborative group project that really took up the particular challenges of urban streams and doing ecological restorations in urban stream context. So some of the work that we did, of course, was academic analysis and reviewing the cutting edge scientific scholarship at hand. And I'm going to start with just a brief set of principles that we extracted out from a very extensive review of the scientific literature around urban streams in particular. So we distilled 4 major principles from that scholarly work, and we looked at case studies of urban streams and restoration around the world. So one of the first principles that we observed was the fact that urban streams are incredibly tied into broader socio-political and indeed capital transformations of these landscapes and their watersheds. And those transformations introduce a lot of patchiness and unevenness in the structure, function, and the historical changes in these streams. So that's the first principle, patchiness tied to historical development and capital change. The second principle is perhaps an obvious one to all of us in this room, and that is the fact that flows of water and ecosystem functions and social dynamics as well associated with urban streams are overwhelmingly shaped and reshaped by technology and by infrastructure, such as storm sewers and other kinds of infrastructure legacies, urban development, and so on. The third principle is about complexity. So we really drew from the coupled socio-ecological systems literature and the complex systems literature around urban streams and observed that they're really characterized by complex interactions and feedbacks between the social and the environmental systems that oftentimes lead to sudden, unpredictable changes, or alternatively may lead to particular lock-ins or kind of stability in these systems. And the sudden change or stability could be good or bad, depending on the context. And the final principle is the fact that urban streams are a place of a lot of complex, overlapping, and diverse sets of values, meanings, priorities, practices, and indeed power dynamics. With just that background, I'm going to dive into essentially the details of the Broadmeadow Brook urban stream segment and the surrounding neighborhood. And I will point out, and we'll see a little bit later, some indicators of the fact that this is a designated environmental justice neighborhood. I believe Martha, you also mentioned this. We can talk about what that means in the context of Massachusetts. But one of the first projects that the group worked on was to actually engage in archival analysis and historical reconstructions of the lands around Broadmeadow Brook. I'm going to hand over to Julia to take us through those findings.
Thanks, Rinku. Hi, everyone. Like Rinku was saying, members of our class dove into the archives from the Worcester Historical Museum. And what we wanted to understand was how the development of Worcester is also intertwined with the history of Broadmeadow Brook. So as Martha mentioned, this is a water body that's fed by urban storm drainage. And so the history of urbanization in Worcester is extremely important for Broadmeadow Brook. And we can see that over time through infrastructure development. So Rinku, if you could scroll down a little bit. Thank you. So when Europeans started settling this land, it was already occupied by Nipmuc people. And when Europeans arrived, they started establishing homesteads in the late 1600s, and they passed down these properties through the generations. And so over time, we started seeing the number of homesteads doubling because they were kind of splitting up the land for different families. And so already we see a development and increasing density of the neighborhood surrounding what we know as the Broadmeadow Brook Sanctuary today. And these homesteaders used the land in particular ways. They cleared a lot of forest, and they started different types of small-scale industries. So the sanctuary had a sawmill, it had a granite quarry, and peat extraction was also happening there. And then into the 1900s, though, Worcester was undergoing huge change with industrialization. And part of this is because of the city's location at the headwaters of the Blackstone River, which was really integral to the development of industrial mills in this region. So in the 1900s, a lot of Worcester residents stopped working in agriculture and started working in factories in Worcester. And so as this industrialization process was happening, more people were moving to the area. And again, the city was growing and increasingly becoming more dense. And with that increasing development and population, there was also this push to kind of control water in the area. So we see that happening in the channelization of the brook in the 1930s. And then, as Martha has also showed us, a portion of the brook was culverted, and then development continued to grow. And one way that we tried to show that was by creating a map of the sewer history. So it's not only trying to control for flooding from the brook, but of course, development means that hopefully you have some formal sewers that pop up. So Rinku will just kind of drive and show us around the sewer map. But what we have here is different colors that show when different pieces of the sewer gray infrastructure was put into place. And so you can kind of see this kind of expanse and how over time the neighborhood was increasingly developed from the perspective of gray infrastructure. And you can see the little blue line, which is the brook still flowing right next to all of this gray infrastructure development. And I don't know, Rinku, if you had anything you wanted to add about this map.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to acknowledge the help of, and really the source of these data, which comes from the City of Worcester Public Works and Parks Department, and specifically Dave Harris, who really facilitated all this data collection integration that then our GIS savvy team within the class was able to put together and develop this map for. So thank you. We're just going to move on down.
Great. So we talked about the further past of the Broadmeadow Brook Sanctuary, but an important piece of this history is also the establishment of the sanctuary with Mass Audubon. But prior to the sanctuary opening its doors in 1991, this forested space was an open space that was used by the community and predominantly owned by a bunch of landowners, but predominantly owned by a Catholic charity. And that charity put much of a large parcel of the land up for sale in the 1980s, which spurred community concern about the fate of this space. So there was a lot of organizing on the neighborhood level. And a lot of that organizing was kind of spurred by an interest in preserving the water quality of the space and fears about how increasing density and development of that land might cause issues with flooding in the local neighborhood. And at the same time, another environmental action was going on downstream in the town of Millbury, which is just across the way from Worcester. And they have a pond called Dorothy Pond, which is kind of at the foot of the brook. And there was a lot of concern about the increasing nutrient loading and pollution of the pond. So the town commissioned a environmental study, and the study indeed recommended conservation of the Broadmeadow Brook area. And so these two pieces came together to kind of spur a lot of political will to allow for the establishment and the purchase of the land by the city of Worcester and the establishment of the sanctuary. So we see the Mass Audubon Sanctuary opening its doors in 1991. And I'm going to pass it back to Rinku now.
Thanks so much, Julia. We are running a little short on time, so I apologize if I breeze through a lot of the details, but the next step I wanted to focus on was the reconstruction that was done by a section of the class, Urban Ecology class, to really focus on the expansion, the gradual and progressive expansion of the land parcels and addition of them to the sanctuary boundaries. And in fact, Galen is right here in this room, and he was the primary author of this piece of the work over here. And he constructed this wonderful map, which actually shows the different owners of the sanctuary. In the green shades, essentially, are the parcels that are formally owned by Mass Audubon. And the other colors really sort of pertain to distinct owners that Martha also talked about. And then Galen actually reconstructed in time when each of these land parcels was acquired by the relevant owner. So you can see if we focus on the Mass Audubon parcels, the green parcels, for instance, the shading indicates whether the parcel has been long owned, whether it was one of the earliest acquired by Mass Audubon. For example, we can see the yellow polygon was one of the oldest parcels, about 20 acres, the two yellow polygons, and then the lighter green followed by the darker green shades represent the later, progressively later land acquisitions. And you can see kind of the acreage of each. And then we had another segment of the class focus on really the partnership. So Martha as well mentioned the fact that Mass Audubon is the appointed or designated manager of this complex sanctuary boundaries, which really is sort of co-owned by multiple partners. So certainly ownership is one of those spaces where there is explicit collaboration, but there's also regulatory networks essentially that these owners and the management is operating within. So the sanctuary, we would say, or the class would say, is an example of a pretty successful public-private partnership. Both kinds of institutions, broadly speaking, public and private institutions, have collaborated in the land acquisition and in engagement and advocacy as well. And of course, the role of civic society, as Julia mentioned, was absolutely critical to the foundation of the sanctuary in the first place. And municipal financing really aided the establishment of the sanctuary in 1991. And continuing land agreements are absolutely critical to the sort of regulatory and ownership patchwork being successful. In terms of the actual restoration, Martha mentioned some of the sources of funding, but they of course include agencies at multiple scales, including the EPA, additional sources of wildlife and watershed restoration support, state grants and budget earmarks, the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and our state energy and environmental affairs, municipal vulnerability preparedness program that kind of goes to climate resiliency, in addition to other sources, including civic society, Mass Audubon members, the Greater Worcester Land Trust here in the city, and of course the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative that Stefanie is going to speak to in a few minutes. I'm going to only briefly mention that the sort of partnership and networks are incredibly important in education and outreach. And of course, Mass Audubon collaborates with multiple institutions in this regard, including the Worcester Public Schools and lots of different universities and colleges here in Worcester as well. And this project is a representation of that. And then I'm going to dive into a really critical piece of analysis that the class engaged in. So one of the things Clark is really well known for is its kind of global leadership and certainly national leadership in GIS and analysis and spatial analysis. So members of this group focused on actually gathering land cover data over 4.5 decades of the history of this neighborhood and analyzing those data in a GIS context. And I'm just going to briefly point out the reconstruction of change analysis that was done, integrating data all the way from 1971 to 2016. And over here, we highlight in green the main sort of transitions and areas of consistency. So the dark green, most of which is within the sanctuary boundaries in the dashed black line, represents areas that did not change, that managed to actually conserve natural land covers, including wetland and forested and other vegetative land covers. And the bright pink areas, I'm not going to sort of speak to every single possible color, which is a type of change, but I do want to point out the bright pink. Those are all areas that over this time frame of 4.5 decades fell to development. So these were natural land covers before 1971 that were lost to development specifically by 2016. And of course, we have the timing of when that happened as well. In order to more explicitly drive home the importance of establishment of the sanctuary, the class group also actually did some additional analysis by comparing the land strictly inside of the sanctuary boundaries to a buffer area around 1 kilometer surrounding the sanctuary boundaries. So basically created a buffer zone, which I can point out again. So this kind of the sanctuary boundary itself is in the dashed black line. I'm hoping that you can kind of see my cursor, but 1 kilometer around that is this dark gray line that was created as a buffer to run comparisons about the efficacy of establishment of these kinds of protection areas. And what they did find was that the differences were stark. So inside of the sanctuary, almost 90% of natural land covers persisted over those 4.5 decades. And of course, the sanctuary itself was operational for only part of that time. Compared with less than half of it outside. So less than half of the natural land cover survived in that 1 kilometer buffer outside of the sanctuary. And most significantly, we see, as I mentioned before, we had a loss of natural land covers to development. So inside of the sanctuary, that loss was absolutely negligible, not even 0.5%, versus outside in that buffer area, we had almost 28% of natural land covers being lost to development, more specifically. All of these land use changes, of course, impact water quality, and portions of the class also actually established which of the areas of the Broadmeadow Brook segment around the sanctuary are actually being monitored for water quality. That's part of broader regional water quality monitoring efforts. Like ZAP the Blackstone, for example. So over here we see 4 regular monitoring sampling locations, and each of these actually has ratings that are available from the report cards published in the ZAP the Blackstone program. I have links to that over here. Once the story map is live, if anyone's interested, you can look that up. And going to jump ahead a little bit again in the interest of time. But I wanted to kind of highlight that what is going on in Broadmeadow Brook and the regional land use changes in this neighborhood is really reflective of changes going on much more broadly, of course, in the Blackstone watershed, connecting Worcester, in between Worcester and Providence, right? So land use change is a primary driver of water quality outcomes, and particularly with urban development and the expansion of impervious surfaces, we have new challenges introduced in terms of not just water quality, but also water quantity. And we have, for example, flashier flows, right, during rain events and storm events. And this kind of is a really important point of connection to the work going on in the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative. And Stefanie will speak to this in just a few minutes. But I just wanted to mention the connection in the context of the story map. I'm actually, in the interest of time, not going to spend any additional minutes talking about the planned restoration. You got Martha's introduction of that piece, but really this is the broader land use history and context and the immediate sort of several decade land cover conversion that's the backdrop for this restoration piece. And that brings us to the planned community engagement more specifically. So one of the first things that we did in thinking about how one might approach community engagement in the coming months in a restoration process that is, of course, going to unfold over years, is to identify what are the best practices that we know about from other examples of successful or unsuccessful stream restoration efforts, keeping in mind the community, right? So the class actually did another review of multiple case studies of urban stream restoration, and we came up with a listing of a particularly important criteria to keep in mind in rolling out and inviting community engagement. And these are, of course, not mutually exclusive. They're closely related criteria, but I'm going to go over them very briefly. One of the first things that we need to keep in mind is we need to actually develop ecological goals in tandem with social goals as well. And this needs to be done while really considering local environmental history and community relationships to nature and needs from the sanctuary, right? So this really sets the stage for the kind of archival work and land use change work that our group did in order to set that stage. It's also incredibly important to share intentions far in advance with the community and invite in, not just think about outreach, but really in-reach, right? Kind of think about inviting in community input at multiple points of the process, and do adaptive management and revisioning of perhaps not just social goals, but also ecological goals as we go. And that really involves co-producing project goals and so on. And this involves really looking at neighborhood level data and assessments so that we get an understanding of the diversity of residents in the neighborhood. Not everyone is the same or has the same concerns or priorities or experiences or values vis-a-vis this natural space. This also means more effectively with these kinds of data, being able to identify key stakeholders early and often and conceptualize the type of engagement envisioned for each stakeholder. Incredibly important, particularly in these environmental justice neighborhoods, is to engage historically marginalized members and portions of the community. And this really involves considering carefully what the barriers are to community participation and actively working to overcome them, including creating safe spaces and accessible spaces for collaboration, and the creation of friends groups for stewardship that incorporates underrepresented minorities, for example. And then finally, to get into the habit of regularly publishing interim monitoring reports and getting feedback on them. So in order to understand the diversity of the community surrounding the sanctuary and setting the context for this restoration, members of this team, and Arman Bajracharya, who is here in this room, was one of the primary authors of the next piece of analysis, which did some deep digging in the US Census. And so I mentioned before, this neighborhood is an environmental justice neighborhood. And the definition, state definition of environmental justice neighborhoods really takes into account multiple possible criteria, including income, minority status, foreign-born status, that's a new addition to the list, and or language isolation, right? And this is incredibly important to keep in mind when thinking about really shooting for greater equity in terms of the distribution of environmental benefits and environmental risks as well. So when we looked at census data, what we did find is in terms of census geographies, for those of you that are familiar with census boundaries, the most of this area pertains to one large census block group, which in turn is comprised of multiple census blocks. And those blocks house between 17 to 33% minority populations. For the overall region, and over here, I'm just going to maximize this map for a second. So the overall polygon is the census block group, and the individual polygons inside of them are census blocks. So overall, the income, the median household annual income is just around $63,600, and we have just under 2.5% of the families in the census block group living below the poverty line. We also have a fairly large proportion of folks lacking higher education. So almost 1/5 of the population lacks a high school diploma or equivalent, for instance. And we have just under 7% of the civilian labor force here in this neighborhood being unemployed. Okay, so, and there are multiple other maps that we have from the census data, but I'm just gonna jump to the final section before handing it off to Steph. And that is what comes next. And so we are planning some of the first additional pieces of community information gathering and engagement. One of the most important pieces being a survey that's going to be done in the community. And the class also actually drafted a prototype survey instrument that we're fine tuning right now and submitting to the Clark University Institutional Review Board in order to approve our human subjects in research protocols. And this survey is going to collect data from residents in the neighborhood surrounding Broadmeadow Brook to understand their histories in the neighborhood, their use and perceptions of the sanctuary, their ideas or their assessments of neighborhood capacity and social cohesion, their practices when it comes to their yard management and their understanding of the potential of rain gardens in particular and perceptions of flood risk, their identification of additional key environmental concerns and challenges and suggestions they might have for working on them, and more broadly linked to the perceptions of environmental issues and knowledge. And finally, of course, the interest and availability and capacity for greater involvement. And as I mentioned, in particularly the environmental justice neighborhood surrounding, what are the barriers to that involvement? This also includes collecting some socio-demographic data, age, gender, ethnicity, race, and so on and so forth to better contextualize those responses and identify challenges. I'm going to end with saying that, this is, of course, work in progress, but if you're interested in this work, please feel free to get in touch with me in terms of the human dimensions and the community engagement work planned, and of course, with Martha at Mass Audubon, the Broadmeadow Brook Sanctuary, and Stefanie, who's going to speak next to the broader context of the Blackstone watershed and the collaborative around the watershed as well. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand it over to Steph.
Thanks so much.
While Steph is getting up her slides, I'm just going to mention her background. So Steph manages the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative based at Clark University, which serves to improve climate resiliency and watershed health in the bi-state watershed's 39 communities. She has an MS in Environmental Science and Policy from Clark University and is a Keystone cooperator, and MVP certified provider. Her interests include land use planning, natural resource protection, ecological restoration, and nature-based solutions to reduce climate hazards and improve community resiliency.
Thank you. So this has provided such a great context. I feel like my colleagues before me have explained everything already on the ground in Worcester. And I think it was Rinku who mentioned that Broadmeadow Brook is really just like a microcosm that is quite representative of the entire watershed. So I just want to give you a little bit more of a watershed context and how important this work is happening in Worcester for this broader region as well. So there's a little star here way up in the headwaters of the watershed where Broadmeadow Brook is. And looking at the river itself, the river is about 48 miles long and it drops almost 450 feet over that time, which is really important to its history because when you have a very steep watershed, you're able to dam it and use that water power, which is exactly what we did in this river system, which allowed us to start the Industrial Revolution here. The entire watershed is about 475 square miles and it encompasses 39 communities over 2 states, so both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And I mentioned that Industrial Revolution, so down in Rhode Island is where we had our first water-powered cotton spinning mill, and this started the Industrial Revolution. We created these canals in certain areas of the river. So same like Broadmeadow Brook, right? We decided, okay, we're going to change how this river flows. We're going to put up really concrete sides and decide we're going to create a straightaway because it's easier for us to manage it. It's also been a river of quite national significance over time. So it was called the most polluted river in America in the 90s due to all the toxic sediments that built up behind those dams. So you can imagine when those cotton mills were still functioning, people would say that whatever color they were dyeing the cotton that day, that's the color the river would flow. And this is not that long ago. This is in, my grandparents' generation. And in 1972, people decided, okay, we're going to do something about this. And it was the year that the Clean Water Act was passed. And it was also the year of the largest one-day regional environmental cleanup, which happened in this watershed. It was called Operation Zap. And 10,000 people got together and removed 10,000 tons of trash from the river. This was massive. This was when we were taking out cars and refrigerators and tractor tires and all sorts of things that really shouldn't be in a river. In 1986, we created the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. So if you're ever driving along and you see those brown signs on the highway and it says Heritage Corridor, you're like, what is that? That's what this is. It's in recognition of its important significance in American history. And in 2014, more recently, we created a national park. So you can see on the map here, there's a really odd national park. It's not like you're driving into Yellowstone. You're like, all right, we're in Yellowstone now. We're going to explore. There are different nodes of this park and different sites that are managed by the National Park Service that you can explore and learn about the history, which the water and the river is critical to. I mentioned the Clean Water Act and ZAP. So in 2022, it's the 50th anniversary of both of those. So we're going to be doing a lot of things in the collaborative and a lot of our partners to celebrate significant progress that we've made. So we know that there's a lack of funding in this region. We know there are a lack of projects in this region. When you look at a couple different, this is just two examples of grant programs. This is the SNEP program and the Division of Ecological Restoration, highlighting the Blackstone watershed. And the SNEP region encompasses all of the Cape, Rhode Island, and the Blackstone. And you can see there's only basically one project in the past 4 years that's been funded in our watershed. And on the right, you see very minimal projects. I think it's two, actually. The yellow one on the bottom left is actually just outside the watershed in the French River. So we know that there's a lack of projects here, and it's not because funders don't like us. It's because we have a lack of capacity. People care a lot. There are a lot of small nonprofits here, but we don't always have the capacity to get together, to think about the big picture, to apply for grants, to get projects on the ground. So the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program got together and said, what can we do about this? How can we improve this? And so they held a series of meetings over 2 years. They had about 140 people engaged, including 40 different organizations and 11 different government agencies. And at the end of it, they came out with this Blackstone River Watershed Needs Assessment Report. And it highlights 20 different actions that we can take in the next 5 years to improve climate resilience and to improve water quality for all of our communities. And two of the things that it highlighted were the need for watershed coordination and the need for capacity building, as well as a number of others. So the first of the 20 different goals was to create a watershed collaborative. We know that working at a watershed scale is highly effective because it's small enough that you can feel like you can actually create a difference. It means that everything that you're doing in one part is going to affect everything else downstream of it. And it's not so large that people get overwhelmed and don't know where to start. So we started in just September 2021. We have over 200 individuals represented already in about 100 different organizations. We get together every month. We usually have about 40 people or so on our calls. And our goal is to work together to get projects on the ground, right? To fill in all those gaps that we have in those maps and to implement the 20 different needs of the assessment report, which I'll go over in just a second. Overall, that goal is local watershed resilience and in the face of both development and climate change, both challenges that my colleagues have mentioned. And also we have this critical lens of equity. I mentioned we have a lack of capacity in the watershed. We also have a number of different environmental justice areas, these overburdened communities. So some of the things that we focus on and that we would like to achieve in the next 5 years are enhanced water quality monitoring. So Rinku highlighted the water quality monitoring that's done in the watershed. We have 75 sites throughout the river watershed. 12 of those are in Worcester. And we need to keep making all of these reports. So the reports that she mentioned, the last ones that we have are 2018, because the group that funds those didn't have the funding to be able to have a coordinator and be able to put out the reports for the last few years. So we want to be able to get more funding for them and make sure that we can act on that information so we know when water quality is changing. We want to encourage regulations that encourage cost-effective nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions can be anything from the rain gardens that Broadmeadow Brook has on their site there, and they can be restoration projects like they're undertaking here. We want to create equitable access to waterways. We know that being on around water can relieve stress and anxiety, and we believe that people should have opportunities for water-based recreation, but not all people have access to our river. We also want to improve aquatic connectivity, removing some of those culverts and those culverted streams, and increasing overall land protection. We know that increasing land protection will improve water quality, and this has all been highlighted at that site scale at Broadmeadow Brook. One of our other shared goals is riverine wetland restoration. So you've seen this picture a few times now. Here's Broadmeadow Brook and that Route 20 corridor, really segmenting this this wetland into two different sections. So this project happening at Broadmeadow Brook is absolutely the exact type of thing that we would like to see throughout the entire watershed, and is so important and enhances our entire watershed improvement. We know overall that the water is getting cleaner. I mentioned the Clean Water Act. This is in large part due to wastewater treatment plants being highly upgraded. But we also know that impervious cover, just like Martha and Rinku both mentioned, really affects water quality. So you can see impervious cover on the right here. We also know that our challenges are growing because of climate change, giving us a lot more water and flashy water, a lot of water at once. And because of those impervious surfaces, as those increase, our water quality is decreasing. So we're kind of at a tipping point right now where we really have to be careful about, while water quality has improved overall, we really could change that if we keep expanding these impervious surfaces and through unsustainable development practices. So the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative is trying to work with communities to enhance those sustainable development practices and make sure that we're thinking about the environment as we develop. So as we add these impervious surfaces, water's running off, going over our cities, rooftops, driveways, parking lots, sidewalks, etc. And it's flowing and catching all those sediments and those nutrients. And as we have increased temperatures, that water is getting hotter, which is critical for our species in the waterways. And as we have this extreme precipitation, so a lot of water at once, we get these really flashy systems. We also have ability for increased drought, which can create drinking water shortages, and dry streams as well, which also can cause severe ecological impacts. But we know that healthy communities depend on a healthy watershed based on, whether it's recreation and tourism, physical and mental health, our built infrastructure is impacted and impacts our waterways, our transportation systems, and our municipal services. We also know that it's pretty expensive to be able to manage all of these things if we're not managing our ecosystem. So if we're flooding more, we're going to have to spend more money on fixing our infrastructure, right? But if we think about it first and try and incorporate these nature-based solutions and incorporate sustainable development practices, we're hopefully saving some money in the long run. We also know that it's critical to make sure we have these resources available for our most vulnerable citizens, because the challenges that we've felt are not felt equitably, whether it's heat islands, low tree cover, high asthma rates, flooding impacts, water quality impacts. The Narragansett Bay Estuary Program created a map throughout the entire watershed region, looking at where our environmental justice areas are and where overburdened communities are. And they looked at each of these different elements and found that the same communities are getting hit again and again for each of these different things. And you can see here in Worcester, it's an absolutely critical area. It's one of our most impacted regions within the entire watershed for each of these. So again, the collaborative is trying to work at multiple different scales to be able to think about this coordination and capacity building. And we're working with a lot of different partners as well, whether it's working on the ground and assisting in technical assistance with things like the Broadmeadow Brook Restoration Project, or whether it's taking the challenges and goals of our watershed and taking them to another level through participation in steering committees or statewide climate change assessment working groups. So just to kind of end on a positive note, with that 50th anniversary, we are hosting a number of different events coming up, including Blackstone Days as the third Saturdays of the month from April to July. This is just a quick overview of what some of those will be. We're doing hikes, we're doing festivals, we're doing tours of nature-based solutions in Worcester. So keep these in mind. You can check out the Blackstone Collaborative's website to learn more. And there are also really big events in celebration of ZAP. One is a cleanup greenup event where we're asking folks whether you have a site in your community where you want to do tree planting or storm drain stenciling or a cleanup. You can sign up to say, I need volunteers for my site. Or if you want to host an event, you can put that in as well and have others join you anywhere in the watershed. And then on September 10th, we're all getting together in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in conjunction with their arts festival. And we're just going to have a celebration with, food trucks and vendors and music and things like that. So we'd love your support where we all are working together to celebrate the improvements that we've made over the past 50 years, and also think about how we can work together on the challenges that we still face within this watershed. So thank you so much. And now we'll move into whatever questions you have.
Yes, thank you very much, Steph, Martha, Rinku, and Julia, all for a great presentation and a really exciting partnership you've created. So with the Q&A, you can either raise your hand using the hand function or put questions in the chat. We're going to have to stick pretty hard to that 10:15 because I'll be switching over to hosting the next session. So, but in the meantime, also please fill out the survey for Mass Land Conference and dropping it in the chat. It's really important to get your feedback to improve the conference for next year. So thank you all.
Rinku, do you maybe want to review some of what you put in the chat there about the survey?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. Good idea. So Debbie had a question in case not everybody's following what's going on in chat. So Debbie Pullen, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, had a question about the survey work being planned and how we were actually going to administer the survey and whether we're planning to provide funding to those who may want to take various actions where they live, but do not have the resources or access to do so. So essentially the survey work we are going to be doing on the ground, in person, door to door, in the field. There are other ways of doing surveys, of course, mail surveys, internet-based surveys, phone surveys, and so on. But this first iteration, we are going to be in the community in person. And by we, I mean myself as leading and coordinating this work, and a number of Clark students. And for that, we have secured funding and through a small seed grant at Clark University to undertake this. And in terms of funding for additional folks, I mean, we don't have the funding at the moment for that, we meaning at Clark or me. But it certainly is my hope that, as this unfolds and with the information that we would be gathering, we could put together, perhaps applications to various sources for additional funding, or that the broader restoration funding sources has components for community engagement and would be able to focus on activities like community members who would want to do follow-up surveys or data gathering or engagement of various kinds as well. So those would be our initial responses. Martha, do you want to maybe speak to the question about funding and community engagement as well?
Yeah, I certainly can. That is definitely part of the bigger overall picture. Water quality enhancement before the water reaches the stream basin, certainly. Funding, so there's a plan in the future to secure funding to be able to do that, to implement that. And there has been past efforts in that neighborhood area through the Blackstone River Coalition to provide funding for downspouts, for example, and rain gardens in the area. So there's a history of that.
Debbie, I see your second question here about having other folks take action and how are they to secure, for instance, native plants. There are other programs as well. So one of our partners in the collaborative is the Green Worcester Corps. And so they specifically work with underserved populations and provide job opportunities to youth that are 200% below the poverty level and also previously incarcerated citizens. And they are looking to do numerous different things, including planting. So they find funding to put in, whether it's adopting a traffic island and planting that, or getting planters outside of businesses or in neighborhoods to increase the amount of green space that we have. We'd love to be able to expand that program into creating things like pocket parks, or green infrastructure maintenance training. We are looking to apply for funding this next year for the next 2 years to be able to create those programs. But that program's only been around since last July, so it's also pretty new.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, so exactly. So I think one of the additional pieces that we could assist with is actually, mapping and then connecting to additional resources out there for those kinds of activities, right? So I also wanted to mention another institution that's there that is also invested in a lot of native plant promotion and so on, is the Worcester County Conservation District. And Steph, I think the Green Conservation, right? The Green Corps, yeah, the Green Corps. Thank you.
Yeah, and I know we're very Clarke-y based right here. I also did my master's at Clarke, and the collaborative is based at Clarke's Marsh Institute. And the young woman who runs the Green Corps is also a Clarke-y, Miranda Hotham. So if anyone wants to reach out to her and learn more about that program, I'm happy to share her contact information.
Thanks everyone for your presentations. I'd love to learn more about how Mass Audubon and Clarke University kind of created this partnership to work together on this project.
Oh, Rinku, can I take that one? We have been working with Rinku and with another Clarke professor for a number of years before this restoration project was even just, before it was even an idea. And so that relationship, which has been built and nurtured, and we've had interactions with Rinku as an individual, but also with Rinku through her classes and her teaching. She's brought students to Broad Meadowbrook on multiple occasions. And it was a natural outgrowth of that partnership that when we were thinking about, okay, who else can we pull into this project? Because this thing is huge. And we are very concerned about the community engagement portion. So who would do a good job with it? And that's when Clarke just naturally came to mind. I will have to say that we have hosted Clarke interns over the years at Broad Meadowbrook as well. So there's a long history. So it's another example of how important and how valuable relationship building is over time.
For the collaborative, when the Narragansett Bay Estuary program decided we want to create this collaborative, we want to host a position to be able to manage it, they put out an RFP, or request for proposals. And so various different organizations applied to be able to host the program. And depending on, what types of resources they were able to offer and what type of support they could offer, Clarke was chosen as the host institution for the program because they have things like a grant manager, which is so helpful for everyone who works at nonprofits. You might be familiar with that. It's really nice to have someone remind you about, oh, your reporting is due, and I've already set up the stuff for you, and I have someone who sends everything through to the rest of the university and gets all of my signatures for me. They have an IT department. They have the facilities set up that I'm able to just have an office and a computer and all of that. So I get healthcare benefits. That was really important to be able to hire somebody. So things like that. So Clark was chosen as the institution.
This is a follow-up question. So if you haven't developed that kind of strong relationship with a school or other partner, how would you recommend a community organization like a nonprofit to begin that?
I would suggest doing a resource analysis. So look around your community and research different potential partners. Just be creative, and then just reach out. Reach out and start a conversation. There is nothing like two people sitting down, come together over a site visit, for example, and just get that conversation going and explore possibilities. And understand that it will take time to figure out what the relationship should look like and to build it. And there may be some false starts. So patience is always a virtue, and don't be afraid to reach out, because I think you'll find that the kind of work that we are all doing is something that everybody is invested in one way or another. We wouldn't be here otherwise. And so there's a mutual interest, and it's just a matter of finding a partner who has the matching mission and vision to work with.
I'll also say, check out if there are other organizations that already have partnerships. So there are a lot of watershed organizations. There are a few different climate collaboratives that are working throughout the state, and they have a lot of partnerships already. So if you were in the Blackstone, for instance, and you didn't know who to work with, you could always contact me and I could say, oh, I think this partner might be helpful for you, or I think that partner might be helpful for you, and kind of start that conversation, or attend a meeting and just learn who's engaged and say, oh, I heard about your work and that's really interesting. Can we follow up on that? That might also be another opportunity.
I mentioned also with some of the university or college partners that many such institutions actually will oftentimes have an office for community engagement. So if you're not, you can just kind of browse their sort of directories and see who is actually working in these kinds of fields. But another sort of one place to start may be these offices, if they exist, and they can connect you with people who are actually doing work in the community. So Clark has one, for example. I mean, it's just for like the academic or scientific partners, for instance.
I'll also add that academic institutions, including secondary schools, are very much focused on project-based learning and real-life learning. So reach out, because you may find, again, willing partners at all levels there.